So 2 years ago, I shot a feature film called Above the Knee, which is about a guy who wants to amputate his leg. This was a very low budget production. We were only 3 people behind camera, and we shot only with one light, the Aputure 600X, and one lens, the Xeen Samyang 35mm t1.5. And I thought to just make this video and talk a little bit about the shooting process, how it was shooting with such a small crew, and talk a little bit about why we only decided to use one lens and one light. So first off, the crew setup. As mentioned earlier, we were only 3 people. I was the camera operator, cinematographer, and director on set. And then we had one of the producers of the film behind camera, who was location, first assistant director, and also helped me set up the light for the film. And then the last person who was part of the crew was a sound recordist. And there was many reasons why we had such a small crew. First off, it was a very low budget production, so we didn't have the resources to have too many people on set. We only used one light, so we didn't really need that many other people to make the crew work. And we also had to be quite nimble and shoot pretty fast, because we had to shoot a lot of pages each day. And most of the time, we only had around 2 people in front of the camera at a time. And the reason why we had so few people, with 3 people behind camera and 2 people in front, when you're making these low budget productions, I think what often happens is that you tend to want to emulate a bigger budget production by having a lot of people behind camera. But for me, when I'm making these low budget feature films, I want to make sure that I can fit everything in one car, just to make sure that we can be fast, so we could easily change locations, so that we don't waste a lot of time. And just logistically, it's much easier to make films this way when you don't really have a budget. So we shot the film on the Ursa Mini Pro 12K. We shot it handheld with an easy rig. And the reason for this is because, like mentioned earlier, we want to be as effective as possible and be as nimble as possible. And just a setup that was easy to move around, where we could get a lot of setups in a short amount of time. And then for the lens I used was the Xeen Samyang 35mm t1.5, and we only used this lens for pretty much 99% of the film. And the reason for this is similar to the camera choice. We wanted to be fast. When you only use one lens, it means that you don't end up spending a lot of time deciding on which lens you want to use. Instead of bringing a whole lens set that takes space in your car and that you have to drag with you, you only have one lens that you have to worry about when deciding on which lens you want to use. But also it saves energy. You don't have to bring equipment unnecessarily, especially since we were only 3 people behind camera. We didn't really have a lot of hands bringing a lot of stuff with us. We could only bring with us the bare essentials. And since we were shooting handheld and we only used one lens, this meant that if I wanted to get a close-up, for example, I actually had to move the camera and get up close, which often leads to a much more dynamic camera style, which very often fits with shooting handheld. So when I'm shooting these scenes, I'm more of an active participant. Let's say I'm using a 125mm lens to shoot a close-up. I'm much farther back and much more disconnected to the scene. And since you're only using one lens, it often leads to having a much more consistent visual style, since the characteristics of the lens or the image stays the same. And then for the light we used the Aputure 600X, which is a pretty big light, especially considering we were only 2 people setting up the light, me and my grip/producer. So we had the light on a C-stand, and then we had a small softbox on the light, and we also shot it through a 8x8 diffusion frame. I think we used this lighting technique for around 95% of the shoot, since we didn't have any other lights. So what I did was that I exposed the camera to the ambient light that was naturally coming in from windows or from practical lamps. Then I used the Aputure 600X and I adjusted it compared to the ambient light that was filling the room. And the reason why I did this is because I wanted it to feel natural and still have that extra high quality look. I don't want the audience to notice that there's a light, but still I want it to look a little bit more heightened than natural light. We had a 20-day shooting schedule, which is a relatively long time to shoot. But the thing about this production is that we had quite a lot of scenes. I think we had around 120 scenes that we had to shoot. For a lot of these scenes, we had to change locations. We had 3 different houses that we were shooting at, also shooting at the office. We were also shooting a little bit outside. So one of the main reasons why we stayed so nimble is that we could easily just pack all the gear and put it into the car and be pretty fast in rigging up and rigging down the equipment. Most of the film is told from a very subjective point of view, from the main character's point of view. So we really want to be up close and really see everything from their point of view. So that's the reason for doing a handheld camera style with only one lens, where we made sure that we had one specific type of perspective so that the audience would more easily relate to the main character and really see it from their perspective. And also, since there were mostly only 2 characters at a time when shooting, it meant that it very much simplified the blocking while we were shooting. We didn't have to get that many shots because we only needed to get the 2 shots, a over the shoulder of each character and a close-up of each character. So we only needed around 5 shots for each scene. But in general, it was a pretty simple shoot. We very much adapted to the few resources that we had, even though I still wanted a little bit more of a heightened look by using the Aputure 600X and actually doing some actual lighting, mostly before I've shot with only natural light. So this was the first major project where we actually set up a light. But as mentioned earlier, we were only 3 people and we only had 4 hands to set up this light, which did add a little bit of extra time setting up the light, but it wasn't a big hurdle since it was only one light. And I think what we ended up getting visually looked pretty nice. I don't think it looks too obviously lit, but it also doesn't look like it's only shot with natural light. It does have a little bit more of a heightened look. And hopefully that also means that it looks a little bit more expensive than it actually was. And the fact that we only had one light and one lens, to me, even though it in many ways was a restriction, for me it was also quite freeing, because it meant that I didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what type of lighting setup should we have or what type of lens should we use. I had also decided that for every scene we're going to shoot at nearly wide open at T2. And the reason why we chose T2 is because that's the widest you can shoot with that lens without it becoming too soft, but still have everything that's in focus be pretty sharp. And it also led to a more dynamic shooting style where I was forced to move if I wanted to change the composition. And it meant that I could focus on other things because I didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about the image too much. The restrictions were already set, so I didn't have to make a lot of decisions while shooting. And also I was a camera operator, cinematographer and director, so this meant that I didn't have to spend any time discussing the shot at all. I could work more naturally and work more through instinct rather than having to explain myself all the time and having to discuss with everyone else what the shot should be, etc. And also we didn't have a external monitor. I just looked through the EVF that comes with the Ursa Pro 12K. I think a lot of people are afraid when you're camera operating and also are the director that you will focus too much on one thing or the other where you can't really focus on both. For example, that you focus too much on the image, so you kind of forget about the acting. But for me, I felt like I was much more into the scene because I was physically there with the camera right next to the actors. I felt more like an active participant in many ways. That was my experience shooting with only one light and one lens on Above the Knee. And I think it proves that you don't really need a lot of equipment or a lot of resources to get the image that looks pretty good, at least in my opinion. And I think when you're working in low budget film production, leaning into the low budget even more instead of being in between where you have a low budget but you still have a lot of people behind the camera and you try to emulate the bigger productions, it can easily lead to a higher chance of things going wrong. So I think for me, what I learned working on this film and working on my previous film, Good Boy, is that leaning more into the low budget and being able to adapt to the few resources that you have really is the way to make a low budget feature film. And I think using just one lens doesn't necessarily have to be a creative constraint or doesn't really need to be a restriction. I think in many ways it can lead to a much more consistent image, a much more consistent visual style. And I think that type of constraint can sometimes look much more professional compared to if you just use a lot of lenses and it doesn't have a cohesive style. That was my experiences shooting with one lens and one light on Above the Knee. And I hope you guys learned something.